This podcast is made possible in part by the generous contribution of our Smart Insiders Plus members. If you're not a member, join in now. Just go to smartrecovery.org/insiders.
Welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast. I'm Luke Frazier. Today on the program, we're going to talk about the decriminalization of drugs with author Maia Szalavitz. She wrote the New York Times bestseller, Unbroken, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, which is widely considered a significant contribution to thinking about the nature of addiction. Her latest book is Undoing Drugs, the Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction. Ms. Szalavitz has written for numerous publications from High Times to the New York Times, The Guardian, and The Atlantic. She has won awards from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology for her 30 years of writing on addiction, drug policy, and neuroscience. Maia Szalavitz, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
I mentioned you're writing for the New York Times, and I'd like to start there. Specifically, you wrote an opinion piece in January about decriminalization in the state of Oregon. How did you figure out, or how did you learn that what Oregon was doing in regards to decriminalization?
Sure. Well, I followed the news of the initiative that proposed it for quite a while, and one of the things I've always thought to be ridiculous is putting people in a cage for using a substance. It just doesn't make any sense. And there's no data to suggest that if you have more drug arrests, you have less drug use. So on its face of it, it fails. Mm-hmm. And if you just look at the research, it increases suicide risk, it increases overdose risk, it increases the risk of HIV, COVID, all kinds of other diseases. And it is not associated with less drug use. So it is just a ludicrous thing. So I was very glad to see that, people were recognizing this. And if you look at public opinion polls, a lot of people, like a majority, say that we should not be arresting people for possession, that, they should have access to treatment. Now, some people think, well, we should arrest them and put them in treatment. But what Oregon sensibly said was that, no, what we want to do is not arrest them. And we don't want this to be a criminal offense. And what we will do is if people get stopped with possession level drugs by the police, they are basically given the equivalent of a traffic ticket, and they have to appear, or actually in this case during the pandemic, it's over the phone, to have an evaluation to see if help is needed. And if help is needed, it will be offered, but it is not mandated.
Okay.
And this is just so much of a better way of dealing with addiction, because one of the biggest factors in success in recovery is wanting to change.
Being motivated, being self-motivated.
Exactly. And so external force actually tends to undermine internal motivation. It's a fundamental finding in psychology. But we think, of course, people with addiction aren't human. So whatever applies in the rest of psychology does not apply. So anyway, what happens with criminalization as well is that it stigmatizes people deliberately. The whole point of criminalizing something is to stigmatize it so that other people won't do it. And so, that's if the point of criminalization is just to punish people, then, and people don't believe they should be punished for whatever it is, there's just going to be widespread flouting of the law, as we have seen with marijuana. A majority of the population has tried that, even though it is still illegal on the federal level. So, what this does, if you don't stigmatize it, if people don't believe that behavior that you make criminal is immoral, what you get is disrespect for the law and stigma that doesn't help. I don't think stigma ever helps, but the point is just that we know that one of the real reasons people don't seek help for addiction is stigma.
Right.
And we have all these national committees and politicians and across the political spectrum saying, oh, addiction stigma is bad, we need to change this. Meanwhile, we're fueling it by criminalizing it.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I was just going to return to Oregon for just a second, and you mentioned public opinion. I think I read that about the initiative passed 58% majority vote. So there you have it. I mean, more than half, and you could even argue that those who didn't vote might agree as well, said, no, this doesn't make any sense. This personal use amount doesn't make any sense to criminalize.
Yeah. And I mean, it was really great to see that. And even the people who were pushing the initiative didn't know, whether it was going to pass or how it was going to do. And they were extremely pleased when they saw the results. I mean, I think, they had to campaign for it during the pandemic. So that made it
harder to organize perhaps and really, get out and talk to people. Exactly. So
the other factor that I think helped in passing it was the Black Lives Matter movement, which put a spotlight on how racist the criminal prosecution system is. And, if we really thought that criminalizing was the best way to treat addictive disorders, rich people would be the first people lining up for it. Rich white people.
Exactly. Well, that's an interesting point, because I think that there has been widespread recognition of something like when crack cocaine crimes were treated more harshly than powder cocaine. But is that also true with other drugs? Are you saying that in addition to that specific instance, there is more structural racism in how drugs are treated, the criminalization?
100%. I mean, it is, you don't even need to read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander to know that this was, although you should.
Okay, good.
That this was enacted for racist reasons, and it has racist outcomes. You cannot scientifically determine that marijuana should be illegal and cigarettes should be legal by any standard that is actually scientific, because one of those things kills about half of its regular users and the other one is not associated with reductions in the death rate. So, or it doesn't kill you, basically.
Right.
Just on a very crude level, it's really difficult to argue that one of these should be legal and the other one shouldn't be based on risk.
But wait a minute. On that point, though, I mean, could you argue that someone who has smoked a large amount of marijuana is not a great driver, that may be distracted when they're driving, and that an auto accident is no?
I mean, first of all, they're way less impaired than alcohol, which is also legal.
True, exactly.
But second of all, most people, drinking and using substances and then driving under the influence is a different matter from using substances, because the vast majority of people will not drive if they are impaired. And particularly, I mean, we saw that actually making that a morally unacceptable thing to do with regards to alcohol really changed, because people used to just think drunk driving was funny.
Oh, right. Or the police officer would just tell you to, now you go home now and stop weaving on the road, Mr. Smith. And I remember, I'm of an age where the Mothers Against Drunk Drivers really came on strong. I mean, all through my middle school and high school, it was all about MAD. And yeah, so well, you could say there's a stigma associated with drunk driving.
And I mean, it's like, the thing is, I guess, I feel like it's okay to stigmatize actually immoral behavior that harms people. I have a problem with stigmatizing behavior that doesn't harm people necessarily. And also just with the hypocrisy of saying, well, you're allowed to get high on alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine, but anything else, you're a degenerate,
Yeah, there it is. That moral failing.
Failing. So it's just it's just inconsistent, and it's racist also. Because the reason the drugs that are illegal is because of a series of racist and anti-immigrant panics that led to the passage of these laws. Like, the only rational drug laws we have in the United States are the enactment of the FDA. And all the regulation that goes around pharmaceuticals with that. Now, you can argue that they're not doing a good job, but that's a different
Right. Okay.
But the rest of our criminal drug laws, the Controlled Substances Act, it's not based on science.
Well, that's you mentioned several times, and I know this from your writings, that you believe in tying things back to research, tying things back to things we can say without putting just emotion into them per se, and that's true about the article in the Times. You talked about and gave citations for things that you're saying. So, I mean, I think what happens, I was thinking about why people still ignore conclusions based on research. And I think it's because of the emotion. I mean, if they knew someone who had trouble with certain kinds of drugs and they felt awful about that, or unfortunately they knew someone who overdosed. I mean, is that true? You think that's true, that it comes from emotion and that's why facts are ignored?
I actually don't.
No, okay.
Because for one, emotions are actually decision-making algorithms. And so you can't do anything objectively because you always have a fundamental thing of, is this good or is this bad? Now, this is a complete digression, but I believe the reason that people don't change drug policy has nothing to do with ignoring science and everything to do with the fact that harsh drug policy historically has won elections for people. And if you look at what our system successfully does, which is lock up a lot of Black and brown people, and what it doesn't successfully do, which is deal with addiction or teen drug use or anything effectively, you have to say, okay, well, why is this completely resistant to logic? And it's not, I mean, there certainly are emotional reactions, but just as many parents have the emotional reaction of, why was my kid allowed to die of fentanyl? And, the other kid who drinks alcohol, like has knows the dose and purity of what they're taking. So,
right. In fact, they may enjoy the fact that it's 80 proof versus 40 proof, but we all know those numbers.
Well, exactly. And, you're not going to, get a shot of whiskey and overdose because there was a ton of fentanyl in it. I mean, I suppose like somebody could poison you, but in reality, like if you just poured it from a bottle from a legitimate manufacturer, that is not going to happen.
True.
Or you're going to have one hell of a lawsuit. So I think, certainly emotion plays into why politicians use this to win elections. And fear is really the emotion that leads most to irrational behavior, in the sense that when people are scared, we are just less rational, like our frontal cortex gets less.
There's the motivation, like you said, with politicians. I mean, there's checking their motives. Well, my motive is to get elected, to continue my career, continue my power. Continue those things that I enjoy, and manipulations in some cases. So that's a very good point. And honestly, I hadn't really clarified that had never been clarified for me, at least in terms of understanding it. Talking about stigma, you mentioned that this stigma is a big obstacle. And again, you cite a study that talks about stigma. Can you tell us more about that and why it is such a strong part of people's addiction?
Well, I mean, a lot of addiction is driven by self-hatred and by feelings of distress. And stigma only adds to that. And what that means is that the more stigmatized you are when you're addicted, the more you're going to try to use. And so, so it's literally counterproductive in terms of that, because you can't shame people out of something that they fundamentally believe is the only thing that allows them to live comfortably. Now, what's important is that there is absolutely no need to stigmatize the use of specific substances. It is perfectly okay, like we were saying before with drunk driving, to stigmatize behavior that harms people. But if you actually want to have someone change that behavior, for example, if someone's drunk driving is driven by an alcohol use disorder, then shaming them out of it is actually going to trying to shame them out of it is actually going to make them drink more. And there was a really cutely titled study by William Miller a few years back, where he looked at the counselors that tried to attack and confront and humiliate people who were had alcohol use disorder. And the headline of the study is basically, the more the counselor confronts, the more the client drinks.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a conclusion. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, it's like, I mean, that's why Miller and William White did a paper, again, a number of years back now, but just reviewing the research on confrontation and humiliation in addiction treatment. And it's like, there's not a single paper that shows that it helps, and there's a lot of evidence of harm. So it was like they were able to make those emphatic statements that you usually can't make in scientific context, because the data is just so strong on this.
Yeah. Well, researchers are careful and are talk about the, the nuances of what they've found, but something like that, if it is so direct, I think you called it a sharp title, or I forget what you said, but it's just right out there. They're just putting it right out there.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really, it is really interesting. And I mean, that is like the whole debate over decriminalization is based on this fundamental misunderstanding of what actually works. You might argue that stigma deters youth from using, but that does not seem to be the case for the youth who are actually at risk of addiction. It might deter someone who would try it once and have no problem, but it's not going to deter someone who is in some kind of emotional agony and is looking for relief. And that's what we need to understand, that addiction is not driven by, oh, I'm having so much fun, I don't care about anybody, I'm an evil, selfish person, and I'm bad, and I just want like only selfish things. That isn't, there are certainly humans like that, and there's certainly people with addiction like that, but fundamentally, most addiction is about self-medication for either being socially outlying, feeling weird,
feeling different, feeling apart from.
And whether that's from a weird temperament that comes in childhood, or from being traumatized, or both, or an incipient mental illness, which is all tied up with all of those things, it doesn't matter. The people are just trying to feel okay. And if you're born as a person who doesn't feel okay in their own skin, and you find a substance that makes you feel okay, then yeah, you're going to do a
natural.
lot of to get that. And I mean, this is why I think the best analogy for addiction is falling in love, or the kind of love you fall in when you have a baby, because what it does is it reprioritizes your entire system. And there are people who do just as crazy things for love and to like try to help their kids as do in line of addiction. And none of those people have no free will. They certainly have a brain that has reset its priorities. And if the priorities are around an addictive substance, that can be a real problem. Right. But it's not about you have zero self-control, because, even in the heights of addiction, people will try not to shoot up in front of the police.
That's quite an image, but that's absolutely true. I would
no one shoots up in court. It's like, if you were genuinely a zombie, like, you wouldn't be able to stop yourself. And so this is also why people have such a hard time saying addiction isn't a choice, because they see this apparently willful behavior. And it is willful, but under constraints that are different from typical. And understanding that is really important. And I think, when we talk about moral issues around addiction, there certainly are moral issues around addiction. Like, people can do harm to others. And, one of the reasons that a lot of people do find some 12-step stuff helpful is that it paves a way for people to make amends and move past that harm.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say that. I imagine you've heard some people who talk about, well, it isn't, there is harm done when a person is using drugs, has a substance use disorder, to those who love them, those around them who care about them. Is that a valid kind of harm, or is that what, it's different than a drug? Yeah.
It certainly is a valid kind of harm. The thing is that, like, the same thing can be said for people with depression or people with bipolar or people with any mental illness, because if you're causing distress to yourself and behaving in self-destructive ways, by definition, the people who love you are going to be upset by that and harmed by that. So my argument is basically that all human beings need to make amends and take moral inventory and do all this kind of stuff. But if you put that only and you force it and you tell people that this is the only way to deal with addiction, then you are saying that addiction is a moral problem, not a medical one, or
Right.
not a psychological one. And so that's when I have a problem with you.
You're listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. Our guest today is Maia Szalavitz, best-selling author, and also a person who writes a lot of opinion pieces for newspapers and other kinds of publications. Maia, you've been talking a lot about, this morality, this kind of, characterization of people as bad. Instead of that, where should we put our attention? I mean, you talk about a gold standard treatment for opioid use disorder, and you talk about how people will do better even if they have a job versus being unemployed. I mean, where should we put our attention if it's not on this kind of idea that there are people who have, who are just problematic in their lives, just dismissing them? Where should we put our attention?
Well, I think all humans have value and have gifts and have ways that they contribute. And just throwing people away, aside from being immoral, is enormously wasteful. People genuinely tend to want to make the world a better place. Some of them may be jerks about it, and some of them may, not care or whatever. But most people, what drives them is they want meaning and purpose and love and connection. And that same thing is true for people with addiction. And the same thing that allows them to persist compulsively despite negative consequences during addiction can also be enormously helpful if you're trying to succeed in a career where you get rejected a lot, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So
like a sales position. I mean, that you have to, actually my wife is in a sales role, and, she knows that it's a numbers game, and that she's most of the time they're going to turn down what she's offering. Right.
And that, it's probably at least as bad or even worse for people who write for a living.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like it's interesting, but yeah, you do have to persist for this stuff. And, sort of, if you think people with addiction are lazy, you've never actually seen them seeking drugs.
That, what, that's true. That's very true. There's a lot of action, activity, and effort that has to go into it. And I've talked on this program about my own use disorders and alcoholism. And, I use 12-step programs. I've also used Smart Recovery, but it's a lot of work to continue an addiction.
Yeah. And so again, are there some people who are antisocial jerks that are addicted? Yes. And such people are actually overrepresented among addicted people, but they are by no means the majority. And the majority is people who have been traumatized, have mental illness, have outlying temperaments that may be a predisposition to mental illness, and are socially isolated, or are just completely in despair about and feel there's no hope for their future. And often that comes from unemployment, lack of, lack of community, all of these kinds of things. So, we have this notion that addiction can happen to anybody, but in reality, that's not the case. Addiction happens to people who are already hurting for some reason. The people, who go into surgery and are like, oh man, this opioid is great, I love this. Most of them say, oh wow, I better not mess with that because I don't want to lose my job, I don't want to lose my wife, but our image is just that like anybody exposed to that euphoria becomes a slave to it, and that's just not how it works. And until we understand that, we're going to keep torturing pain patients and maltreating people with addiction as well, because trying to punish our way out of addiction, which is what criminalization basically does, is using the one thing that by definition doesn't stop addiction.
Right. So it's so counter to the reality is I think of what I'm hearing you say. But you also wrote about policy, and I'm going to read from the column. To reduce stigma and combat the addiction crisis, drug policy must be liberated from the idea that without criminal penalties, no one would ever quit drugs. And is this? I mean, what can you say more about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, universally, people who have quit multiple substances say cigarettes are the hardest thing to kick. They are legal. People kick them all the time. Not to say that it's easy, but we don't think the way to stop cigarette smoking is to jail people for it. Another behavior that's really difficult to change is like diet. Nobody, we don't think, well, we need the donut police because that's the best way to manage overeating. We recognize that these are behavioral problems that are not, that persist in the face of negative consequences. And so using negative consequences to fix them is not the way to do it. People, again, tend to think that like, if you're addicted, you are a zombie who's having so much fun using that, like you never have any second thoughts and you don't want to, you would never want to quit.
Yeah,
a lot of times,
certainly not true. Certainly
no.
not true.
Well, and a lot of times people avoid treatment because it's coercive and punitive. If you make treatment warm and welcoming, like something like a needle exchange, which isn't treatment, but which can refer you to treatment, you go there, they're there to serve you. They want to meet you where you are. And if that happens to be, I really want to stop shooting up, they're going to help you do that. And if that happens to be, I need a clean needle, they're going to do that.
Well, that's meeting where a person is at and not being, wagging the finger.
Right. And so, nobody forces people to go to needle exchanges. People show up voluntarily because they are welcomed, because they get something that will protect them, because they do want to be safer and not necessarily destroy their health. There are all kinds of complexity to this, but if people didn't think that, oh, if I go to treatment, I'm going to be berated and humiliated and forever stigmatized, a lot more people would go to treatment. And I mean, we see this in Portugal, where they did decriminalize and they massively expanded treatment, and they have many more people going into treatment than they did under the criminalization. First of all, they had more money.
Okay, they devoted more resources. More resources.
Well, and if you, again, like if you make a product or something attractive, people will tend to want it, as opposed to if you force people to buy that thing, even though it's lousy. That's not the way we deal with any other consumer item in this country. And we tend to see healthcare as a consumer item for worse and not better, but that's how we see it. So, okay, let's have the free market here. Let's make treatment providers have to attract their clients rather than, 30 to 50% of them being mandated there for a legal reason.
Yeah. And that comes down to the, for instance, courts ordering people to go to support groups. And you walk into a support group, and I've seen this personally. People don't want to be there that just because the judge told them to go to this, and there's papers that people have to get signed saying that they did go to this support group meeting. And conversely, if someone, let's say is arrested for drunk driving, the attorney will tell them, oh, you should go to these support group meetings. It will look good to the judge. That's not trying to address a behavior. That's, trying to manipulate the system. Is it not?
Well, I mean, I think they probably also hope that the person will get sober or get control over their drinking.
Okay, good. Well, maybe I'm being more cynical than I should be.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think but the real problem, I think, is when you have like a 12-step group or a SMART group or whatever group or therapy group in treatment where most of the people don't want to be there, like it undermines the therapeutic environment. Because like, let's say I have to share about something like deeply personal, like, you know, losing my mom when I was a kid or something. I'm just making this up. But
sure.
you know, if I want to share about that and everybody else is sitting there rolling their eyes and being like, oh gosh, I'm going to look at the clock, when is this darn thing going to be over? That is just not very conducive to people getting better. And so helping people, you know, really be able to have a welcoming, warm, therapeutic environment where, you know, it's like, I mean, you want to keep the stuff in those groups confidential, but if people are forced to be there, they have no incentive to keep it confidential. They can go and, you know, sit at the bar later and laugh about it.
Yeah, well, which then makes the people who are trying to, you know, share authentically less likely. There's a stigma there. I mean, someone would be laughing and saying, "Can you believe they talked about blah blah blah?" Exactly.
Well, right. And I mean, this is why, you know, I think that, you know, maybe in some extreme instances, you might have to use coercion, but why don't we use coercion last, not coercion first?
No.
And that's really my policy argument.
That's a great point. I'd like to, before we end our conversation, I definitely want to bring up medication-assisted treatment. And actually, I've heard a new term or a new way of referring to it, medication-assisted recovery.
Well, I don't like either of those.
No, you don't. Okay. What would you characterize it or say it?
Medication.
Medication. Okay.
Prozac, like we don't say if you're in therapy and you're on Prozac, you're getting Prozac assisted treatment. We recognize that some people recover just with Prozac alone. And look at the data on what works in terms of opioid use disorder. The medication with no counseling and nothing is what cuts the death rate. So if anything, it should be called counseling assisted treatment, which has a nice acronym of CAT. But anyway, I just think like, just get rid of the assisted, like medication treatment, just like anything else. Like we don't say, you know, you had a heart attack, we're getting medication assisted treatment.
Right. As if there's another way that you could just will your way out of having another heart attack.
Right. And also, I mean, the thing is, of course, you should probably change your behavior if you're eating steaks and fries every day. And, you know, that is a way in which like counseling and stuff like that might actually prevent your next heart attack. But again, like there's a real difference between engaging in counseling when you want to be there and being forced to attend, which is what often happens in these medication treatment programs where, you know, you have to go X number of sessions a week or something in order to get your medication. And we don't do this with diabetes. We don't do this with things that we consider to be actual disorders. You know, so again, like that's why I don't like either of those terms, because I think that for one, people who are on medication, whether it's Prozac or whether it is methadone, that's just fine. Like, it's not like you're still using, you're not really clean, which I hate the word.
Because if you're not clean, then you must be dirty.
Exactly. It's like, it's a terrible, you know, so if we just recognize that recovery, you know, harm reduction defines it as any positive change as determined by that person. So that means that a person who starts using clean needles as opposed to not previously using them, that is a form of recovery. It is a stage in recovery. And it, you know, whatever the person does to move forwards, you know, and again, like real human change tends to happen in fits and starts. It doesn't happen in a linear fashion. People usually don't overnight go to complete abstinence. They usually have to learn how to do that. And learning often involves error. So you need to like account for that.
Yeah, you need to make sure that there's, you know, you mentioned motivation, that there's a sense that, you know, there's a benefit to me and there's a benefit to others around me. And so I'm going to try. I may not succeed at first. I may not succeed completely, But and that brings up the Dr. Volkoff talking about, you know, her own view or the view of there can be stages of change, like you mentioned, but also success with cutting down, say, with use of alcohol, or, you know, making sure and addressing the opioid crisis and overdose deaths by those kinds of things you've mentioned, the needle exchange, the safe using centers. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but so
prevention sites is now the term.
Is Dr. Volkoff on the right track?
Yeah, I think so, actually. I think that, you know, certainly she and I have various disagreements, but for the most part, like, I think she sees addiction as a little bit more zombie-like than I do. But it's a matter of degree. It's not a, you know, extreme difference. But I do think that, you know, the data is really clear, especially with alcohol where there's more data. You know, some people resolve alcohol use disorders by moderating rather than quitting. And they genuinely do resolve them. It's not like, oh, they just moderate for a while and then they get worse again. No, certainly that can happen. Just like you can be abstinent for a while and then, you know, for people who have the most severe form of alcohol use disorder, moderation is going to be a lot harder. You know, because it's just like you have to make many decisions in moderation, whereas in abstinence, there's just one decision you have to make. And so a lot of people who initially think that their preference is moderation end up moving towards abstinence because it's just easier. You just don't have to deal with it anymore.
Yeah, well, the key being moving and I mean, I love the analogy. I'm sure you've heard of it, where if someone has said that they want to be abstinent and they're on that path, on that journey, it's like starting a journey from Washington, D.C. to Boston. If you get a flat tire in New York, you're not going to turn around after you change the tire and start again in Washington. You're just going to keep going.
Right. No, and I think, like, I mean, this is why we need more expansive definitions of recovery, because, like, you know, in 12-step programs, if I'm sober for 30 years and I use for one day, I'm considered as much of a newcomer as somebody who drank for 30 years and is abstinent for one day. And that is a ridiculous standard. Like, I will never win this, but I think that the best way to fix that problem would be so that, like, okay, from an abstinence 12-step perspective, okay, you have 30 years, you get 90 days back, you get your 30 years back. Because that would allow both for the recognition that this person has been at it for a long time.
And there was some benefit to that. They received some benefit. Others around them received benefit from that. It wasn't that everything goes away because of one day of use again.
Well, it's funny because there was a probably myth that went around AA in New York, at least in the 80s and 90s. And it was about this guy who, Irish guy, every year he got completely wasted on St. Patrick's Day and then started again and got his year. So he just had a year over and over and over again.
Okay.
And, you know, like, more power to him if he actually exists. But it's a kind of interesting story to think about.
He had, you know, he had the willpower, but he made a decision that for him, St. Patrick's Day was just too hard to give up. Too hard to drink the green beer, and walk down Fifth Avenue. I'm not sure where the parade is.
Exactly. That is, yes. But right. Like, I mean, I think what's really interesting about that is that person should have 10 years or whatever. Like, if they are keeping, you know, they shouldn't keep having a year over and over. You know, it does make you think. And this is, again, where, like, there can be real problems with the idea that, like, once you touch the substance, you're completely powerless, because that is just not what generally happens. If you believe that that is the case, then it is much more likely to happen. And that is called the abstinence violation effect, where you think, well, oh, okay, I already blew it. You know, I may as well
go ahead. May as well, right? Return to however I was using or drinking before. Well, that's you make some very, very good points, very research-based points, and things that you've thought about, obviously written about. Anything else you want to share with us before we end the program today?
Well, I think one thing that I always want to mention, if I can, is that in the course of this opioid situation, pain patients are being massively harmed by the idea that everybody who uses opioids long-term is addicted, and that nobody benefits from opioids for chronic pain. And like thousands of people are like dying by suicide, or just being disabled, or dying by overdose, because they have been cut off from medical opioids and not given any alternatives.
So they're in chronic pain. They're in just crushing pain at all times.
Yes. And like, I just think, why is it okay if you're having severe pain in the last few months of your life, then you can have opioids. But if you're going to have that kind of severe pain for 30 years, you can't. Now, again, it doesn't mean that opioids work for everyone. They certainly don't. And they certainly make some people's problems worse. But there are very clearly people who benefit, and they are right now being extremely harmed by our absurd policies. And so I mention that because I think the recovery community and the pain community need to come together on this, because if nobody is a medical pariah that can be thrown out of care, oh, you're addicted, go away, then pain patients will not have this horrible situation, and people with addiction will be treated with dignity and respect. And if one gets mistaken for the other, it's not going to be a problem, since everybody should be treated kindly. But I think, right now the situation sets people in recovery against people with pain, because the people with pain are like, well, the existence of you folks is the reason I can't get my medicine. And, no, the reason that you can't get your medicine is stupid drug policy, but to work together is just much more effective. And we have the same interests in terms of that.
Right. This has been a fascinating conversation, really eye-opening for myself. You cast things in such a clear and logical, but also, I don't think you ignore the fact that they're human beings. And you talked a couple of times about human beings who have to want to do this. So it's been a great conversation. Maia Szalavitz, I really appreciate you taking time. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. I'm Luke Frazier. If you want more information about Smart Recovery, you can visit smartrecovery.org, where you'll find links to social media, links to articles and research, and all kinds of other information about meetings and joining Smart Recovery for your own use disorders. Until next time on the podcast, stay healthy and stay connected.